chapter 1. I want to spend kind of all of our time in Nehemiah today and kind of get about 5 lessons from Nehemiah. I have a PowerPoint that does not work overly well on an outdoor screen that's small when everyone's far away. We're going to do our best. I can't see it, so if I progress the slides in the wrong manner, just wave your hand at me, let me know that I'm not moving along very well. I want to pick out just 5 lessons from Nehemiah today. Obviously 13 chapters. You can pick out a lot more lessons than 5, but I want to talk about this. Nehemiah, if you're kind of working through your biblical history in your mind, this is after the fall of the Northern Empire and the fall of the Southern Empire. And this is now looking at the very end of the period of exile, entering into the period of return. So you have 3 main returns of Israel back to the land. And this is going to be the third one. You have Zerubbabel, who brings back a number of people. And then you have Ezra, which is the previous book. Ezra the scribe brings back a number of people as well. And they begin to rebuild the temple. But due to a variety of reasons, all the work in the temple pretty much ends. They're unable to complete the work. Nehemiah is going to lead the third return in 445 BC. 14 years after Ezra leaves, Nehemiah is going to start his journey towards Jerusalem. And they're going to rebuild the walls. Once the walls are rebuilt, then they can rebuild the house of God. Once that happens, then people can rebuild their houses as well. And life begins to kind of take on some semblance of normality after all of these years. But that happens with Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is not the person you would imagine to do the job. He is not a political leader. He is not an architect. He is a cupbearer for the king. And Nehemiah has a lot to say to us as people who are planning to use our lives in God's service. That's kind of one of the things we're talking about as we're looking forward, as John mentioned, of having a location to work in. That along with all the extra commitments that kind of puts on us to be in a location and supply the needs for that, it really puts some onus on us to also get busy doing work. So Nehemiah is an excellent example of what does it look like for someone who has their life kind of governed by and planned for by God. And what is it like to live a life in the service of God? Nehemiah is that example. So I want to pick out just kind of 5 ways that Nehemiah made that happen in the book. And I can't tell, is that the blank? We doing good? All right, so the first one is Nehemiah prioritized prayer. They're all going to start with P, and they're all going to be a little bit cheesy. But it's a good mnemonic device to get us to remember all the things that go along with it. Nehemiah prioritized prayer. So here in verse 1, Nehemiah opens up his book to let you know who he is. These are the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hekeliah. And it happened in the month of Shizvel, in the 12th year, that I was in Susa the citadel, and Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. And I asked him concerning the Jews who had escaped and survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And he said to me, the remnant that are in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. And the walls of Jerusalem are broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. Now we're going to see pretty soon that Nehemiah lives a pretty privileged life, inside of the citadel. And so as he sees another fellow Jew come back, he recognizes that he's been over in the area that he's from, and he wants to know how things are. And the report's bad. They're not doing well. The walls are broken down. They're living in shame. And notice in verse 4 that as soon as I heard these words, I sat down and I wept and I mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Before anything else happened in his life, prayer was the first thing. He sees this need, he sees the problem, he recognizes that something needs to be done, but before he moves a muscle, so to speak, he begins the process of prayer and fasting. And then the next few verses here are going to be a prayer from him. O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenants and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive let your ear be attentive and your eye open to hear the prayer of your servant that I now pray before you day and night for the people of Israel, your servants, confessing their sins of the people of Israel. Now, the prayer kind of continues on and down through the end of the chapter. We won't take the time to read the entire prayer. But he clues us in the very last verse of chapter 1 that he's the cupbearer of the king. So he's someone who stands before the king on a regular basis and holds a position of preeminence. And in verse 1 of chapter 2, he makes the point that in the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Artaxerxes, when the wine was before him, I took the wine and I gave it to the king. And he makes the point here in verse 1 that he hasn't been sad in the presence of the king. So whatever personal strife he has, he's kept that away from his work. When he goes to work, he's professional, he does his job. And here in verse 2, he lets it slip. So during this time period of prayer and fasting, his face now shows what his inner turmoil is. Because in verse 2, the king asks, why is your face sad, seeing that you're not sick? There is nothing but sadness of the heart. And notice he said, I was very much afraid. I don't know exactly what the rule was for Artaxerxes. I don't know if he only allowed happy people to be in his king. I don't know what the exact rule was, but whatever's going on, he's afraid. And I think he's afraid because what he's going to ask in the later part of chapter 2. And so here in verse 3, and the king said, then I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city and the place of my father's graves lie in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? And so the king asked me, what are you requesting? And then in verse 4, there's this little tiny phrase, and so I prayed to the God of heaven. Here's a man who prioritizes prayer enough that whenever the king asks him, what do you want? Before opening his mouth, he prays again. So he's been fasting and praying day and night. This is an opportunity where the king asks him, what are you asking of me? And before he actually makes his request, he makes another prayer. And then he asks the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, then send me to Judah, to the city of my father's grave, that I may rebuild it. Big request. And it gets bigger as we get down through chapter 2, but we won't take the time right now to do that. And then as you get over into chapter 4, I know we're skipping around a little bit. Chapter 4, they return, they scout out what needs to be done for the walls. They start planning what they need to do, and then they start building. But by chapter 4, there's two individuals in particular who begin to oppose the work and make threats against Nehemiah's life and the life of the workers. And so here in chapter 4 in verse 9, it says, or verse 8, it says that they plotted together to come and to fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. And we prayed to our God, and we set a guard as a protection against them day and night. So here's this conflict. Here's something coming against them to do them harm. And before they do anything, the first course of action is prayer. He prays when he hears the news before he requests from the king. He prays again when the king specifically asks what his request is. And once conflicts arise here in chapter 4, prayer is his first thing. Prayer is always a priority for Nehemiah. And I would suggest to you, pretty much anybody who does great acts of faith inside the entire Bible, prayer is always prioritized for them. As one person said, you tell me about your prayer life and I'll tell you about your eternal life. I think that's a pretty accurate statement. Prayer should not be an afterthought, but it should be a forethought. And for someone who's going to let their life be used by God, Nehemiah is an example of a person who prioritized prayer and made prayer a forethought before his actions. The second thing I would suggest from Nehemiah, if you go back to chapter 2, is that he pondered in proximity. Again, I'll start with P, all rather cheesy, but hopefully it'll stick in your mind. There is a lot that you can do from afar. Nehemiah, I'm going to assume here, if he's a cupbearer for the king, he's probably not a poor man. I'm assuming he could probably also read and write. I'm assuming that because Nehemiah, I think, writes the book of Nehemiah. He could have sent messengers or delegates. He could have done a lot of things to help out financially for all the people of Israel. But in chapter 2, Nehemiah does not content himself with viewing from afar or praying from afar or sending aid from afar. Nehemiah insists on being with his people. The people who need the help, he's going to go there and to do the work. So we read the first couple of verses in chapter 2. And when the king asks, in verse 4 he prays. And then verse 5 is the request, if it pleases the king, your servant, if I found favor in your eyes, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. And the king said to me, with the queen sitting beside him, how long will you be gone, and when will you return? And so it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me, to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And the letters of Asaph, and the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me the timber to make the beams of the gates of the fortress and the temple, the walls of the cities, for the houses that I shall occupy. And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon him. Nehemiah asked to go close and to see the walls for himself. And he lived in the palace of a king. And what he does is he takes a life of luxury, a position of power, and he goes and he lives in a broken down city and works hard, day and night for months. And once the walls are rebuilt, they don't stop there. He continues to rebuild the temple and rebuild the houses in Jerusalem. And the work doesn't stop there. Once they then confess their sins in chapter 8 or chapter 9 and reinstitute all the priesthood, he gets them busy. And it doesn't stop there, and the list kind of goes on and on for Nehemiah. His work is really never really done. He sets a time here in chapter 2 to go back to the capital in Susa, but by the end of Nehemiah, he's lived in Jerusalem for years and has never gone back. He isn't content to live a life of luxury or a life of abundance and let God's work go undone. And sometimes we exactly like to do just that. We like to pray from afar. We like to send financial support from afar. We like to send warm thoughts and warm greetings. And we have been really blessed with text messages and emails and Facebook messages and all the other new age stuff that I just am too much of a Luddite to care about, in order to contact people from afar. But we're called to visit orphans and widows in their afflictions. We're called to bear one another's burdens, and that is really hard to do from afar. We're called to encourage one another and to help one another. I would suggest this, that God in his great love drew near to us in order to save us. He left his home in heaven, and he came to live as mortal man to draw near to his people. And that's the whole point of John chapter 1 and verse 14, that the Word became flesh and he dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, so that we could always be near him. Shouldn't we also have that much love for one another? That we sometimes leave our homes of comfort and lives of luxury, and that we give up some in order to draw other people near to Christ, so that we can always be near them. Nehemiah did not content himself by being far away. He pondered in proximity what could be done. And to go along with that same idea, he also prepared. We read the verses here in chapter 2, or some of the verses in chapter 2. They said, I want you to give me letters so I can pass through the borders. I want you to give me a letter for Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, so that he can cut timbers and have them sent over to me. As you get into later into chapter 2, verse 13, whenever they get into Jerusalem, he kind of skulks around by night. And he went out by night to the valley gate and the dragon spring and the dung gate and inspected the walls of Jerusalem. Before he actually put men on the wall and before he gave them tools in their hand, he went out and he inspected everything. He wanted to know what needed to be done. The same thing in verse 18. And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good. And so the words of the king that had spoken to me, and they said, let us rise and build. And so they strengthened their hands for the good work, in verse 18. Nehemiah and the people who were building prepared. And I would suggest that God always prepares his tools. Abraham spent 40 years in the wilderness before, I'm going to get my ones. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before God used him to call his people out of Egypt. Abraham spent, I'm not exactly sure how many years before he was called, sacrifice Isaac, but it was over 25. Think of John the Baptist and the years that he spent in the wilderness preaching. Seems like an odd way to prepare a tool, but it worked. It was very effective. And instead of just calling the apostles and immediately sending them out, they spent 3 years with Jesus before Paul was actually sent off to go and preach somewhere else. He spent 3 years in Arabia. The list kind of goes on and on. If we want to be people who are going to devote themselves to do God's work, we have to be people who are devoted to preparation. We need to be people who are studious in our discipleship. We have to know what we're going to be talking about to other people. As you get over to 1 Peter chapter 3, he mentions that we need to have a defense prepared. Now, preparation works in that way. And we need to be people who are ready to work, not just zealous for work. And Nehemiah gives that excellent example, that he both arranges what needs to be done before he goes. He's an individual who then scopes out all the work that needs to be done. And then as you get through the next couple chapters, you see that he then assigns people to the places that is best prepared for them or best suited for them and for them to work together. He is a man who is diligent in preparation. But the problem is that oftentimes we kind of stall out in preparation. We get stuck in let's get ready mode. So let's get together on Wednesday nights and let's Bible study. Let's get together on our small groups and let's study. And let's get together on Sunday mornings and study some more. And we spend all of our time in study, and sometimes that's kind of where we stop at. I want to be prepared for all the defenses I need to give. I want to be prepared to teach someone else. And then we always feel that we just don't have quite enough preparation to actually get the job done. So we prepare for a little longer. There's an old story about a man who wanted to build a house. And so he went around to all the general contractors and builders and asked them about cost and supplies and what things they would use in the house and how they make their plans. And so he found a builder that was very diligent. He says, here's all my blueprints for the last couple houses I built. And they were the most minute, detailed blueprints. And because if you're that detail-oriented, I want you to build my house. I want you to do it right. And so 6 months goes by, and there's no ground that's broken on the new property. And so he goes to the builder, and the builder says, well, I'm still working on a few details in the blueprint. I want to make sure it's right. I want to make sure you are exactly happy with it once we start building the house. The guy says, well, that's fair enough. And I understand preparation takes time. So 9 months goes by. The guy comes back and says, well, I'm still working on those blueprints. Still doing my best to prepare for all the work that you gave me to do. It's a big house. A lot to get done. There's outlets and there's insulation. There's the right timber to pick out. There's flooring that needs to be ordered and prepared. We're busy getting ready. After 18 months, the guy says, I can't take it anymore. I need to get a house. I have to have a place to live. And sometimes that's how we are. We spend a lot of time in preparation and never actually get busy building. And Nehemiah doesn't do that. If you go over to Nehemiah chapter 6, he is passionate in his production. Again, I'll start with P, all a little bit cheesy, but hopefully it sticks with you. In Nehemiah chapter 6 and verse 15, I want us to consider how steadfast they were in their work. And so the walls, in verse 15, were finished on the 25th day of the month in Elul in the 52 days. Out of work to rebuild a wall in just over or just under 2 months. And I want us to give us an idea of kind of what that took. Back in chapter 4, remember we had mentioned that there's two individuals who plot and plan against Jerusalem. Back in verse 8, verse 9, they pray for protection. And then in verse 15, he then describes chapter 4 of what it took for them to get the work done. So our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plans, and so we all returned to the wall, each to his work. And from that day on, half of my servants worked in construction, and the other half held spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah, who were building the wall. Those who carried burdens were loaded in such a way that each labored on his work with one hand and held his weapon in the other hand. And each of the builders had a sword strapped to his side while he built. And the man who sounded the trumpet was beside him. And so you have this organization where everybody is both on guard for warfare and also building at the same time. This wasn't an easy, let's just get together and build, but there's this organization where now we're splitting our labor force in half. Half are guarding, half are working, and even a smaller portion of those who are working have swords or have spears. They're working with one hand, they're armed in the other hand, and yet still in 52 days they were able to rebuild the entire city wall. It's pretty amazing. And if you look at the numbers that are given a little later on in chapter 7 about how few people there are that come back during this time period, and even smaller numbers of them who are able to work, it was an amazing how much they got done in those 52 days. Preparation is absolutely crucial. If you're going to do work, you have to be ready for it. But staying in preparation mode and never actually working never actually gets the job done either. If you go over to Nehemiah chapter 2 again, back in chapter 2, we'll look at 3 passages. And the last one, I think maybe we're still in the right place in the slide. He needs to pass over pessimism. Again, super cheesy. That happens all the time. I guarantee you, if you want to go and do any good work, you would imagine that all your fellow Christians, all your brothers and sisters would encourage you in the good work that you're going to do. Unfortunately, that never happens. There is always going to be someone who's going to be a naysayer. Always. I don't know why that's always the case, but that just always seems to be the case. And if you want to go and you want to do work, someone's going to have something negative to say to you. I got to worship with the congregation. It's been almost 4 years ago now. Almost exactly 4 years ago. And a couple of the old retired men had gone to the flea market. They set up their own booth. Out of their own pocket, they paid for the booth, set up tables, and every Saturday when the flea market was open, they would sit down and hand out tracts to people who came by and hand out flyers for church and offer Bible studies. And wouldn't you know it, half the congregation was really offended by that. How would they waste their time going to the flea market when that's never going to do any good? There is always going to be somebody, if you're going to be busy doing work, who's going to say something negative to you. I guarantee it. And Nehemiah is not immune to the same things. Here in chapter 2 and verse 19, it makes the point when Sanballat and the Hornite and Tobiah, the Ammonite, the servants of Gershom and Ahab heard it, they jeered at us and despised us, saying, "What is this thing that you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king?" The same thing happens in chapter 4 and in verse 2. And he said in the presence of his brothers and the armies of Samaria, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore Jerusalem for themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of the rubble, even the burned ones too?" And that doesn't end there either. Over in chapter 6 and in verse 2, Sanballat and Gershom said to me, saying, "Come and let us meet together in the plain of Ono." But they intended to do me harm. And I sent messengers to them, saying, I am doing great work, and I cannot come down. Why should I stop work and leave it and come down to you? You're going to find it anytime you go to do good work. You're going to have somebody who feels guilty that you're doing more good work than they are. You have people who think that your work's going to be in vain, that there's no point in it. You're going to find people who are non-Christians who are going to be fighting against you because they don't want you to be working for God. Always going to be the case. But we can't get paralyzed by pessimism. Can't do it. If you're going to be busy for God, if you're going to have your life used for His service, then having other people say, "Well, no, that's not a good enough work," or "No, you're not going to succeed," or "Why aren't you doing work in another area?" Somehow that comes up a lot too. I'm going to go over here, I'm going to do work. Well, they don't need work here in Williamsburg. They need work over in Newport News. Why not go to need it just as much as Williamsburg? Well, sure, that's true. Everywhere needs work. But why do I need to discourage someone else from doing work wherever they happen to be? And yet that happens always. Let nothing stop you from doing God's good work. So Nehemiah prioritized prayer. Before he acted, before he moved, God's requests were always first on his mind. He wasn't willing to just watch from afar and let other people do the work. He pondered in proximity. And he went where the need was, and he worked diligently there. But before he went, he prepared himself, and he prepared the men who were to do the work. But he didn't get stuck in preparation mode. He was passionate in his production. And he had to pass over all the pessimism that he was going to find. But you get to the very end of Nehemiah. This isn't the only time he says this in the book, but it is the last words of the book. And I want us to consider how important that is. It's almost a half sentence that Nehemiah ends with, where he simply says in chapter 13, verse 31, "Remember me, O God, for good." Isn't that we all want to be commended by God for good? Each one of us has work to do, a labor to be done, and how you do it is important. I think next week that's probably what we will be talking about, so I won't tread too much of my own territory for next week. But how do you get your work done? If you have siblings, and you know that you and your siblings do not do work at the same rate, at the same level, or the same passion, especially if you have the same goal in mind. If you've ever been through school and you have like a school project that happens, at the same grade and all your siblings go through that, you realize that your project and their project, it's not going to be the same because you have different passions. We all have the same school project when it comes to working for God. How we do that is important. Nehemiah had his work to do, and he did it diligently, and he asked God to remember him for good. When we look back at the end of our life, whether it be weeks from now, months from now, decades from now, do you think that God is going to remember you for good for the work that you did for his kingdom? If not, then this is a great time to make that change, to get busy doing the work. If we're going to be committed to a location in a few weeks, let's be also completely committed to having our lives used for God's work. John has picked out an invitation song, number 822. If there's anything we can do, encouragement or